Abraham Lincoln Freemason. An address delivered before Harmony Lodge number 17, F.A.A.M, Washington, D.C., January 28, 1914, by Dr. L.D. Carman, P.M., with an appendix containing the actions taken by the Masonic Grand Lodges of the United States on Lincoln's death, printed for private distribution, 1914. Just for a note, on the Masonic abbreviations here, I've decided to just say the abbreviations, the initials. Abraham Lincoln Freemason, Worshipful Master and Brethren. The subject of my remarks this evening will be Abraham Lincoln Freemason. It may be regarded as somewhat presumptuous to give this address this title, when Lincoln is not considered as one of the Masonic presidents of the United States, and while Abraham Lincoln and Freemasonry might be deemed by some as a preferable title, Abraham Lincoln Freemason is nevertheless the subject. It once was facetiously attempted to prove that Lincoln was a Mormon, because in one of his early speeches he made a number of references to throat cutting, the penalty of the first Mormon oath, and because in another address shortly before his first inauguration he stated that sooner than surrender a certain principle, he would have his body burned to ashes, and those ashes scattered to the winds of heaven, the peculiar language in the third Mormon oath. While it has been said that anything can be proved in Masonry, it is not attempted to prove that Lincoln was a member of the secret society called Mormons or of the secret society called Freemasons, but a number of interesting facts considering Lincoln and his connection with our order are presented for consideration. One of Lincoln's most intimate friends in early life was Bowling Green, an earnest Mason, a past master, and a member of the Old Grand Lodge of Illinois, the records of that lodge showing him to have attended the communications of 1826 and 1827. While Lincoln was never formally received into the Masonic order, he first saw Masonic light in connection with his friendship and close association with Bowling Green. Honor to him who may safely be called a Masonic preceptor of Abraham Lincoln. It was not an unusual practice in the early days of Masonry in this country in sparsely settled localities, remote from an active lodge, for several members of the fraternity to get together, form an emergent or occasional lodge, and make Masons, with no record of being made of the proceedings. If Lincoln was not thus made a Mason, he in some manner obtained considerable Masonic knowledge, and probably from Bowling Green, prior to 1837, when Lincoln removed from Menard County, Illinois, to Springfield. When in 1842 Bowling Green died and was buried with Masonic honors, it is somewhat significant that Lincoln was selected by the fraternity to make the address at the funeral, an address he was unable to finish, breaking down with emotion during the delivery. If Lincoln was not a Mason irregularly made, he must have been in sympathy with the known objects of the order to have been invited to speak at a Masonic funeral. Clinton Lodge number 19 at Petersburg, Illinois, was granted its dispensation by the Grand Lodge in October 1842, and the funeral referred to was evidently under the auspices of the Masons who formed this lodge. As a matter of historical interest, the list of members of Clinton Lodge in 1843 is given, as all members were acquainted, if not friends, of the future president. It will be noted that John McNeil, the betrothed of Anne Rutledge, Lincoln's first love, was junior warden. List of members of Clinton Lodge number 19 in Petersburg, Illinois, 1843. John Bennett, W.M., Martin S. Morris, S.W., John McNeil, J.W., Nathan Dresser, Secretary, Jacob West, Treasurer, David McMurphy, S.D., William B. Clerk, J.D., Aaron B. White, Tyler, M.M., John B. Broadwell, Charles G. Brooks, Louis B. Wynn, Charles B. Waldo, Thomas L. Harris, Benjamin Newman, F.C., Ambrose E. Rankin, E.A., and James Short. Prior to 1840, this was a lodge at Springfield, Illinois, which at the organization of the existing Grand Lodge of Illinois in that year became Springfield Lodge number 4. List of members of Springfield Lodge, 1840. M. Helm, W.M. Alex Lindsay, S.W. James Adams, J.W. Love, S. Cornwall, Secretary. M. Boyle, Treasurer. M.J. Kelly, S.D. J.S. Killerly, J.D. James Maxey, Tyler, M.M. James R. Gray, Philo Deers, B.C. Webster W. Cudmore, Samuel L. Hesser, Joseph Fiery, Isaac R. Brancher, William Harvey, Francis Springer, S.A., Douglas, James Gevesler, Jr., Alexander Shields, James F. Reed, J. Wickersham, John Euler, James Briggs, John S. Roberts, L.B. Adams, F.A. McNeil, James Shepard, Henry Carrigan. James Shield, later General and U.S. Senator, was J.W. of this lodge in 1841 and was afterward the first Master of National Lodge in this city. As Harmony Lodge is an offspring of National Lodge, we have an indirect connection with the first lodge in Springfield, Illinois, whose members were fellow townsmen of Lincoln, if nothing more. Stephen A. Douglas does not appear in list of members of Springfield Lodge after 1843. In his younger days, February 22, 1842, Lincoln delivered a long lecture on temperance, one of the Masonic virtues. On another anniversary of the birth of that distinguished man and Mason, George Washington, Lincoln delivered a speech on interventions, in the course of which he alluded to the first intervention, the fig leaf apron, showing his acquaintance with that venerable Masonic claim that Adam was the first Mason as he wore the first apron. Lincoln also had some knowledge of operative masonry. The hammer, square, and compass were familiar to his hands, and in his early occupation as surveyor, he laid out squares and calculated horizontals and perpendiculars. For not by dainty hands in kid the shackles fell to rust, but warty horny were the palms that made the nation just. Lincoln's Masonic words. References are to Federal edition of Lincoln's works. They were pillars of the Temple of Liberty, and now that they have crumbled away, the temple must fall unless we, their descendants, supply their places with other pillars, hewn from the solid quarry of sober reason. 160. In a speech about the bank, made in 1837, occur the words, quote, "Oath of secrecy, divulged a secret. Does not every merchant have his secret mark? Sound the alarm." 1-139-140. Another sentence. Such belong not to the family of the lion or the tribe of the eagle. 1-157. In the Lost Township letter, with the composition of which he probably had something to do, occurs the following: I defy Daniel Webster, and I defy King Solomon. 1-285. As this letter was making sport of James Shields, an officer of Springfield Lodge, this sentence may have had more intended significance than would ordinarily appear. Here are some of his Masonic words. I wish to stand erect before the country. 3-169. Will cling to it with a desperate grip. 3-169. The sharp point against him. 3-169. If you have ever studied geometry, you remember that by a course of reasoning, Euclid proves that all the angles in a triangle are equal to 2 right angles. 469. The cements which bind together the different parts of the union. 4-258. The circle from which all their propositions radiate. 4-263. Charter of Freedom. 5-155. Marks another step. 5-161. Our children and our children's children. 6-151. The word spot has a peculiar place in Masonry, and this word affords the basis for the famous so-called spot resolutions introduced by Lincoln in Congress during the Mexican War, December 22, 1847. In his speech at Philadelphia before inauguration, he said that he would rather be assassinated on the spot than surrender, and the words fatal blow, though copied, were frequently used in the joint debate with Douglas at Freeport, August 22, 1858. Several times he used the words darkness to light, and in his telegram to General Sherman on his march to the sea, he said, "It brings those who sat in darkness to see a great light." 7-274. In a letter to Speed, he said, "All will be harmony," a sentiment peculiar to this lodge at least. 2-3. In speaking of slavery, and not of Masonry, he once referred to blue lodges, as they call them everywhere, doing their secret and deadly work. 2-271. We are all familiar with that now English classic, the address at Gettysburg, Masonic in every line. Note the emphasis, by repetition, placed upon the word dedicate. Mark the conclusion. Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The man who wrote the Gettysburg Address, not a Mason? Listen to these words. Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it. And having thus chosen our course without guile and with pure purpose, let us renew our trust in God and go forward without fear and with manly hearts, with malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right of God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in. The man who spoke these words, not a Mason? With the tinge of a mystic, the inspiration of a prophet, the man who regarded all men as his brethren, that man was not a Mason. The man who spoke like a Mason, lived like a Mason, and died like a Mason, that man not a Mason. No, 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 and 1,000 times no. The true Masonic spirit breathes through the life of this remarkable man. In 1866, the government published a volume containing the tributes of foreign nations to Abraham Lincoln. In this single volume appear the resolutions and tributes of 44 foreign Masonic Grand Lodges and subordinate bodies. Was Lincoln a Mason to them? Of these 44 lodges, how many called Lincoln brother? Only 20. Here is a documentary evidence of a kind, 20 contemporaneous documents concerning our illustrious brother Abraham Lincoln. As the volume referred to is not a rare work, only the list of lodges is here given, with such portion of the resolutions as referred to Lincoln as Freemason. Foreign Masonic lodges on death of Lincoln. Belgium. Septentrion Masonic Lodge of Ghent. Lincoln personified the cause of liberty and human fraternity. France. Lodge of La France Union at Choisy-le-Roi. Department of Seine. We mourn the loss of a brother whose memory will ever be dear to patriots and Freemasons. He honored Masonry. From this date, the name of Abraham Lincoln is inscribed on the list of our members, and at each session for 3 months, a brother will rise at the call of his name and answer, "Abraham Lincoln died like a Mason to elevate humanity outraged by slavery." At the expiration of 3 months, we will celebrate a Masonic funeral to his memory. Perfect Union Masonic Lodge, Orient of Confolius, Charente. New Friendship Lodge of Grasse. Sympathy for the glorious death of one who, after having used the hammer, square, and compass, those living implements of our immortal society, etc. United Benefactors of Gentilly to the Grand Lodge of New York. The very illustrious brother Abraham Lincoln has given his life for the love of his country, etc., thus setting the most noble example a Masonic brother can give to his brethren. Freemasonry has suffered an irreparable loss. Orion Lodge of St. John, Gaillac, Orient. Gaillac. Lodge of Toleration and Progress, LUR. Sympathy for the memory of Brother Lincoln. L'Escole de la Morale Lodge of Libourne. Lincoln, our illustrious brother, Lodge will mourn for 3 months. Lodge of les Arts Réunis, Orient of Masson. The Glorious Martyr of Equality and Fraternity, Friends of Truth Lodge, Metz. Lodge of St. John of Jerusalem, Nancy. The great Masonic association that gloried in calling Mr. Lincoln one of its children. Clement Friendship Lodge, Paris. We Masons mourn him not only as a brother but as a friend of the whole human race. Lincoln's first thought was the Masons' motto, fraternity. Lodge of Triumphant Friends, Paris. Chapter of Mars in the Arts, Paris. A stronger bond, a more intimate union than the common tie united us, particularly to his great heart. Lincoln was our brother. Abraham Lincoln was our brother. Sovereign Chapter of the Friends of the Country, Valley of Paris. Glory to our brother Lincoln, who practiced the virtues inculcated by our order, and who Masonry is proud to number among the number of her children. L'Avenir Lodge, Paris. Regret for the death of brother Abraham Lincoln. Scotch Masonic Lodge, La Prévoyance, Paris. St. John's Lodge, number 147, Heroes of Humanity. All Freemasons mourn the death of Abraham Lincoln, and this lodge also regrets the loss of a man who was an honor to our order, etc. Ancient Accepted Scotch Rite, Paris. Lincoln, whom we had the honor to count among our brothers. Lodge of Henry IV, Paris. Perseverance Lodge, Paris. Has any living man practiced so well the humane principles inculcated by Freemasonry, and who is more deserving of the regrets of their brethren? Lodge ordered a triple morning salute in memory of brother Lincoln. Lodge of Admirers of the Universe, Paris. The memory of brother Abraham Lincoln. Scotch Hive Lodge, Paris. Freemasonry is moved with just indignation at the atrocious crime that has deprived it of one of its most illustrious representatives. Condolence for the loss of the zealous Mason, who has proclaimed the great Masonic principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Memory of the very illustrious brother Abraham Lincoln. Lodge of St. John of Jerusalem, Paris, to Grand Lodge of New York. The glorious death of one who had handled the hammer, square, and compass. Harmony Lodge of Paris. Lodge St. Pierre des Acacias, A-C-A-C-I-A-S. Acacias. Brother Abraham Lincoln, member of the Grand Lodge of New York. Death of their brother Abraham Lincoln. Lodge of the Fraternity of the People, Paris. The horrible outrage to which brother Lincoln has fallen a victim. Scotch Lodge, number 116, The Right Line. The crime, etc., deprives Masonry of a brother. Right of Mizraim, Supreme Grand Council, Loge Renaissance. All the virtues possessed by Lincoln are Masonic virtues, symbolized in our degrees of initiation. When an apprentice, he purged his mind of all the subversive passions, which was an indispensable preparation for the good conduct of life. As a companion, he had learned to live orderly by labor, and a scrupulous observance of right and justice, a course which was marked out by a rule, square, and compasses. Finally, like Hiram, he succumbed to the blows of an outrageous pride for having remained inflexible in the discharge of his duty. Lodge of St. Augustus the Beneficent to Grand Lodge of New York. First, the son of a laboring man, he was an apprentice. Then he became a journeyman, and last a master, thus realizing our Masonic symbols. Cradle of Henry IV Lodge, Pau, P-A-U. Friends of Perfect Union Lodge, Perpignan. An illustrious Mason, the very dear brother Abraham Lincoln, our very illustrious brother Abraham Lincoln. Royal Scotch Lodge, the elect of St. Stephen, and Lodge of Good Faith, St. Germain and Laye. The Gazette de France, May 5, 1865, spoke of Abraham Lincoln as of the Grand Lodge of New York, page 124. Grand Lodge of Freemasons of Ireland, Grand Lodge of Freemasons of Scotland, England, Lodge of Gymnosophists, London, Abraham Lincoln, member of the Grand Lodge of New York, Italy, Social Progress Lodge, Florence, Lodge Anziani Virtuosi, Leghorn, Lodge Le Lume e la Verità, Messina, Italian Una Lodge, Parma, Grand Orient of Masonry in Italy, Turin, Italian Masonic Lodge, Carthage and Utica, Tunis, Germania of the Golden Horn Masonic Lodge, Constantinople, have lost a brother in the person of the illustrious deceased, and have seen but few like him since the foundation of the order. It will be noted that there are several references in these resolutions to Abraham Lincoln, member of the Grand Lodge of New York. It is possible that this error arose from the fact that the Grand Lodge participated in the funeral ceremonies in New York City, as the Grand Lodge and other Masonic bodies in the several states through which Lincoln's body was carried on its way from Washington to Springfield took part in the ceremonies in their states. The Grand Lodge of New York, however, was unaware that Lincoln was a member of that lodge or any other, as the D.G.M. of that jurisdiction on April 19, 1865, the day of mourning, addressed a letter to Brother B.B. French of Washington, which was answered as follows. From Masonic Monthly, May 1865, page 351. Office of the G.M. of Knights Templar of the USA, City of Washington, April 21st, 1865. R.W. Robert D. Holmes, D.G., Master, G.L. of New York. My dear Sir and R.W. Brother, Right Worshipful. Sorry about, yeah. All right, here we go. Yours of the 19th is just received. President Lincoln was not a Freemason. He once told me in the presence of M.W. Brother J.W. Simons that he had at one time made up his mind to apply for admission to our fraternity, but that he feared he was too lazy to attend to his duty as a Mason, as he should like to do, and that he had not carried out his intentions. I told him that it was not too late now. Well, said he, as likely as not I shall apply to you some day to let me in. He was the most pure-hearted, honest, upright man I ever knew, and ought to have been a Mason. Had he been my own father, I could not have lamented his death more sincerely than I do. Very truly and fraternally yours, B.B. French. An examination of the transactions of all Grand Lodges of the United States in existence in 1865 shows some references by the Grand Master to the death of Abraham Lincoln, or some action by the Grand Lodge of the following jurisdictions: Connecticut, Massachusetts, District of Columbia, Nevada, Indiana, New Hampshire, Illinois, New York, Iowa, Ohio, Maine, Wisconsin. As would be expected, no notice of the death of the President was taken by any Southern state, but their transactions for 1865 afford pathetic reading of tales of fire and sword. Other Grand Masters and Grand Lodges occupied themselves with matters of Masonic routine only. These actions of the Masonic Grand Lodges of the United States upon the death of Lincoln have not until this time been brought together. Comparison has been heretofore made between Abraham Lincoln and one of our first and most excellent Grand Masters, in his virtuous and amiable conduct, in his unfeigned piety to God, and in his inflexible fidelity to his trust, the F.A.A.M, who was also slain, and like him, his memory is not dimmed by the passing years. Appendix, Connecticut. From the address of David E. Bostwick, G.M., May 10, 1865. While our hearts were swelling with gratitude to God that the dark clouds seemed lifting with signs of a coming peace, we are again plunged into the depths of sorrow at the loss of our beloved Chief Magistrate, upon whom all seem to lean with confidence in this great emergency, struck down by the hands of a cowardly assassin. District of Columbia, May 2, 1865. From the address of George C. Whiting, G.M. On the evening of the 14th of April, a day which had been previously observed by the Christian world as the anniversary of the cruel murder of the Prince of Peace, our honored and beloved President, whilst enjoying a brief relaxation from the responsibilities and cares of his high official station, was stricken down by the hand of a wretched and misguided man. His crime no mortal thought can measure, and none but him who hath said, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay," can adequately punish. He stands before the bar of the Judge Eternal, and our just though puny anger is hushed in the awful wrath of offended deity. As members of a loyal and order-loving association, peculiarly bound to be peaceable subjects to the civil powers, and never to be concerned in plots or conspiracies against the peace and welfare of the nation, nor to have undutifully to magistrates, are called, nor to behave undutifully to magistrates, are called to share in the deep and universal sorrow. It is meet that we should recognize the amiable and virtuous conduct and the inflexible fidelity to his trust, which so marked him as the fit successor to our illustrious brother, the great and good Washington, and in some appropriate form give expression to our sense of the loss our country has sustained. For in the language of the great poet, he hath borne his faculties so meek, hath been so clear in his great office, that his virtues will plead like angels, trumpet-tongued against the deep damnation of his taking off, and pity like a naked newborn babe, striding the blast, or heaven's cherubim, horsed upon the sightless couriers of the air, shall blow the horrid deed in every eye, that tears shall drown the wind. Ah, that was horsed. Let me read it again. Hath borne his faculties so meek, hath been so clear in his great office, that his virtues will plead like angels, trumpet-tongued against the deep damnation of his taking off, and pity like a naked newborn babe, striding the blast, or heaven's cherubim horsed upon the sightless couriers of the air, shall blow the horrid deed in every eye, that tears shall drown the wind. That portion of the address of the G.M., alluding to the assassination of President Lincoln, was referred to brothers B.B. French, R. McCurdy, and P. Hooey, H-O-O-E, who retired, and subsequently reported the following preamble and resolutions. Whereas, on the evening of April 14th, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States of America, was stricken down in death by the hand of an assassin, by which a cloud of relief was spread over the people. By which a cloud of grief was spread over the people, in the deepest affection of whose hearts his many virtues had enshrined him. And whereas, although he was not a member of our order, by his pure, honest, and upright life, every act of which was marked by charity, brotherly love, relief, and truth, he illustrated all the attributes that should beautify the life of a free and accepted Mason. Therefore does the Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia deem it eminently proper to announce to their brethren and the world their public appreciation of the dread calamity which has befallen the nation in the tragic death of its chief magistrate, their sorrow for its occurrence, and their abhorrence and detestation for the crime which, and the criminal who has so wickedly removed him from the scenes of the earth. Resolved, that while the blow of the assassin which struck down Abraham Lincoln almost paralyzed the hearts of his fellow citizens, to which he seemed dearer than any man who has lived since Washington, it has in no wise disconcerted the action of the federal government, the existence of which depends not upon the life of any man, but ever lives in the patriotism of the American people. Resolved, that this Grand Lodge can find no words of sufficient strength to express their horror and detestation of the act which deprived our country of its good and pure and virtuous chief magistrate, nor of the wicked assassin by whose hand the awful deed was done, and who has gone to meet the penalty of his crime. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Resolved, that this Grand Lodge hereby expresses its high admiration of the character of the late President, whose life was without a blemish, and who passed away from earth in the very zenith of his fame, the goodness and kindness of whose heart was a proverb, and shall live in the memories of a grateful people, and be handed down from generation to generation, as long as time shall last. Resolved, that the bereaved widow and children of our murdered friend have our sincere and heartfelt sympathies, and our fervent prayer that the God of the widow and the fatherless will so temper this dreadful affliction with mercy as to enable them to sustain their burden with fortitude, and to say in submission and humility, the Lord gave and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Resolved, that the officers and members of this Grand Lodge will wear the usual badge of mourning for 6 months, in testimony of their respect for the memory of the great and good man who has fallen. Resolved, that the Grand Secretary be directed to cause these proceedings to be published in the National Freemason and the newspapers of this city, to have a copy of them properly engrossed and signed by the proper officials, and under the seal of the Grand Lodge, presented to the family of the deceased, which was received and the resolutions adopted. Indiana, tribute to Abraham Lincoln. At the meeting of the Grand Lodge, May 24, 1865, Brother Albert Lang asked that the rules be suspended to permit him to offer the following, which was granted. Whereas, in the inscrutable providence of Almighty God, Abraham Lincoln, the first citizen of the United States by official station, the first by the rectitude of his life and daily conduct, the first by his devotion to the honor, interest, and integrity of the country, the first by the power and influence which he wielded with wisdom, sagacity, and courage, has been stricken down by the hand of an assassin. And whereas, it is due that this Grand Lodge, representing 328 subordinate lodges scattered over the whole expanse of the state of Indiana, should give expression to their sentiments at the appalling blow, which, like a thunderbolt from a cloudless sky, struck the heart of the whole nation. Therefore, resolved, first, that we took with abhorrence upon the act which took from us and the country which he so faithfully served, the man who, through 4 years of deadly strife, with an eye single to the maintenance of the government, has guided and directed us, and who, with the haven of peace and security in sight, was by a dastardly act snatched from the full fruition of his labors. Resolved, second, that we concur with freedom-loving people all over the globe in the expressions of regret and deep sorrow which this event has called forth, and that we will cherish Abraham Lincoln as the great emancipator of an oppressed race with undying affection, trusting that history, poetry, and art will unite to keep his memory green in the remembrance of virtuous men forever and ever. Resolved, third, that a copy of these resolutions be forwarded to the bereaved widow and family of the deceased in token of our heartfelt sympathy with the great loss which they and the country at large have sustained. Above unanimously concurred and adopted. Concurred in and adopted. Illinois. From the address of H.P.H. Bromwell, G.M., October 3rd, 1865. That G.M. is Grandmaster. I told you I was going to use abbreviations, okay? I apologize for that. On the 14th day of April, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, was slain by the murderous hand of a ruffian. He fell at a time when he could least be spared, when all eyes were turned to the good President as to the only being who could restore the Union, heal the wounds of war, and set the government in motion in harmony with the new order of things. At that moment God permitted him to be taken away, to teach us that the Most High ruleth in the kingdoms of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. Abraham Lincoln, the pure patriot, the wise statesman, the good president, the honest man, died a martyr to his country, to liberty and truth, and was mourned for as no man has ever been mourned. He was not a Freemason. But in his life and character he illustrated many of the virtues and taught and cherished by the craft. I herewith submit a letter of sympathy and condolence from Renaissance Lodge, working under the jurisdiction of the Grand Orient of France. In October 1867, the Grand Lodge of Illinois chartered Abraham Lincoln Lodge, number 518, at Young America, Warren County, Illinois, Iowa, from address of Edward A. Gilbert, M.D.G.M., June 6, 1865. Forth from the furnace fires of the most terrible internecine struggle of all time, the nation has come, as came Jupiter, out of the war with the Titans, endowed with resistless strength and power, and her noble escutcheon cleansed from the plague spot which has so long polluted it. The Republic stands proudly now in the light of God's approving smile. Quote, redeemed, regenerated, all caps, disenthralled, unquote. Now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious by our boys in blue, and all the clouds that lowered upon the land, in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. Now our brows bound with victorious wreaths, our bruised arms hung up for monuments, our stern alarms changed to merry meetings, our dreadful marches to delightful measures. Grim-visaged war hath smoothed his wrinkled front, and now instead of mounting barbed steeds to fright the souls of fearful adversaries, he capers nimbly in a lady's chamber to the lascivious pleasing of a lute. Truly, the cloud has turned a silver lining to the light, but yet, like a scintillant diamond in a setting of jet, that silver lining is bordered with the emblems of mourning. Even in the hour of victory, while the glad Io rang over the jubilant North, and the recreated South, the recreated South I'm going to repeat this line. Truly, the cloud has turned a silver lining to the light, but yet a scintillant diamond in a setting of jet. That silver lining is bordered with the emblems of mourning, even in the hour of victory, while the glad Eo rang over the jubilant North and the recreated South. There was death in the White House. Unquote. The head of a nation. Head of the nation, the wise and pure, the clement and faithful president was, quote, done to death, unquote, by the assassin's bullet. And he who was fast becoming the idol of his countrymen was not, exclamation point. Mournfully sublime was the instantaneous and universal transition from delirious joy to profoundest sorrow. In a moment of time, the notes of exultant clarions and the sonorous tenor of the Republic's Te Deum changed into muffled drum beats and the thrilling baritone of heart-born wailing. He had borne his faculties so meek, had been so clear in his great office, that his virtues did plead like angels trumpet-tongued against the deep damnation of this taking off. Like a wounded hyena in its expiring throes, rebellion struck her last vicious blow at the nation's life, and thereby slew the truest friend the insurgents had. Yet, how swift was the punishment the fiendest agent of a fiendish cabal received. Repeat that sentence. Yet how swift was the punishment the fiendest agent of a fiendish cabal received. And how few there are that mourn, because amid retributive physical pangs of the most exquisitely painful character, this modern Judas gave up his worthless life and went to his reward. Let every true Mason praise the GAOTU, that's Grand Architect of the Universe, that the execrable conspiracy against the government of our fathers was in part unsuccessful, and that with scarcely a perceptible deviation from their direct course, the gallant ship of state went steadily on, albeit her pilot had fallen at her helm, a victim of one of the most damnable crimes of history. Could any fact more forcefully demonstrate the stability of the Republic, more notably evince the protecting care of the omnipotent, capital O, more grandly attest Columbia's title to emblazon on her shield the additional motto, Esto Perpetua, than that the war-worn ship of state, unchecked by that sudden sound and shock, which would have precipitated almost any other country into the maelstrom of revolution, pursued her stately voyage, leaving as luminous a wake as ever behind her. God himself had given her a mission to perform. He knew that, quote, humanity with all its fears, with all its hopes of future years, was hanging breathless on her fate, unquote. And in his good providence he saved her harmless from the shock, incapacitated the appalled people, soon to see that it, quote, was of the wave and not the rock, unquote. The helmsman was gone, but ever strong and great. The glorious ship sailed on, her meteor flag, to be sure, was at half-mast in sorrow for her loss, but in mute yet eloquent attestation of the worth of him who was receiving the sublimest funeral obsequies the world ever saw, and worthy was he of them. For he won not power with the sword, but by the love a nation bore, for him whose very soul was stirred with love for those he ruled over. Or, I'm supposed to be singing this, I guess. For he won not power with the sword, but by the love a nation bore. For him whose very soul was stirred with love for those he ruled over. With steady stride onward he went, the light of great deeds on him beaming. Up, up, Fame's mountain steep ascent, its peak unto, and while around him streaming were fruition's banners, and from that summit high, like Moses, who Pisgah, P-I-S-G-A-H, ascended to die, he sprang from the earth to his home in the sky. Mason's hands assisted to bear him to the, quote, equal grave. Yeah. Masons' lodges were clad in the emblems of mourning for departed worth, and Masons mingled their laments with those of the nation which, around his bier, and gathered in sorrow, longing to see of this stroke the end, in mourning a father and a friend, and their offspring in all coming time shall remember well the ruler brave, and be guided by his star sublime, and shall make a shrine of his lonely grave. Why didn't that happen? And it was fitting that Masons should thus evince their love of country and their regard for its murdered ruler, who, though he was not a Mason, revered the order, and was himself composed of the stuff out of which the most capable, the most benignant freighters are made. Yeah, that's what it says. Benignant freighters, F-R-A-T-E-R-S, are made. The committee on the address reported as follows. Your committee recommended that we hereby express our satisfaction with the appropriate and timely eulogy of the death of President Lincoln, and that the thanks of this Grand Lodge are due to the MWGM for his portion of his address. On motion of Brother Parvin, G.S., the most worshipful Grand Master, appointed as a committee to report resolutions expressive of the feelings of this Grand Lodge in regard to the assassination of our late President, the following brethren: Colonel John Scott, Governor William M. Stone, Lieutenant Governor E.W. Eastman. The Special Committee on the Assassination of President Lincoln presented the following report and resolutions, which were unanimously adopted. Your committee, appointed to express by resolution the sense of the Grand Lodge of Iowa in relation to the awful calamity which has befallen our nation in the murder of Abraham Lincoln, late President of the United States, knowing that words are but a mockery, and cannot relieve the burdened heart, yet feeling that propriety and duty require that this Grand Lodge should not be silent, present the following resolutions. 1. Resolved, that our lamented late President we recognize a patriot. In our lamented late President we recognize a patriot and statesman of purity and wisdom, who has safely carried our country through the most terrible ordeal of the past 4 years, earning the admiration of the world by his purity of intention and singleness of purpose, and the unbounded gratitude of 30 millions of his countrymen. That Abraham Lincoln should and will be revered while time shall last, as great and good among names not born to die. 2. Resolved, that as Masons we are taught to detest conspiracies, plots, and rebellions, and in an especial manner to abhor assassination. 3. Resolved, that in depriving our nation of its chief by assassination, we recognize a crime without a name, and for which language fails to express our grief and horror. 4. Resolved, that we humbly approach the grave of our murdered President, and with sorrow for his sad fate, will rear a broken column to commemorate his many virtues and his untimely death. John Scott, W.M. Stone, Enoch Eastman. Proceedings of the Grand Lodge of Iowa, June 8, 1865. Maine. From the address of William P. Preble, Grand Master, May 2, 1865. We will not be unmindful of the great loss sustained by our beloved country in the fiendish and indignant assassination of one whose greatest failing, if any he had, was that from the uprightness, purity, and tender-heartedness of his own nature. He could not conceive that any human being could be so utterly depraved as to raise his hand in murderous assault upon one who, by his unceasing and untiring loving kindness, forgiveness, and patience, stood between him and his rebellious and traitorous associates and sympathizers, and the fierce and long-endured and smothered wrath of a justly incensed and outraged people. Though our horizon is again overshadowed with clouds, just as we all begin to hope that the glorious sun, S-U-N, of peace was about to rise upon us and bless us, we will not give way to useless repinings, but with a firm faith and reliance that our Supreme Grand Master does not permit any calamity, however great or appalling, to befall an individual, much less a nation, but for some great and wise purpose, we will, while renewing our vows of faithfulness to the great principles of our order, bow in humble submission to his inscrutable dispensations, earnestly invoking his protection and guidance upon our whole country in this her time of peace, and that in his own time he will again unite us into one great and happy people. All right. Massachusetts. Page 20, 1865, P20, 1865, Massachusetts. Here we go. Bethesda Lodge. Forwarded resolution of sympathy to Grand Lodge, quote, the expression of their most sincere condolence and regret on the loss of so great and good a man as Abraham Lincoln, whose memory should ever be cherished by those who profess the principles of our ancient institution, unquote. Valparaiso, July 31st, 1865. Nevada. From address of Joseph DeBell, Grand Master, Virginia City. Quote, April 19th, 1865. On this day were held the funeral obsequies. Sorry, I'm getting a little tired. April 19th, 1865. On this day were held the funeral obsequies of our late Chief Magistrate. The hands of an assassin robbed of life the beloved head of the nation. That nation covered its face and wept. I deemed it both right and proper that we, as Masons, should join in the concord of sorrow and deposit in the open grave of the martyred President our chaplet of living laurel. I therefore convened the Grand Lodge, and that body, accompanied by a large number of the fraternity, joined in the funeral procession. New Hampshire. From the address of Jonathan E. Sargent, G.M., June 11th, 1865. We, as Masons, as well as citizens, may properly mourn for the national calamity which recently befell us, when the chosen head and ruler of this nation fell by the hand of the base and cowardly assassin. New York. G.L. Report, 1865, page 43. Report of D.G.M. Robert D. Holmes, May 10th, 1865. On the occasion of the obsequies of our late President, I deemed it proper to respond to the invitation of the civic authorities to take part in the solemn ceremonies of the day. In this, worshipful Master, sir, you agreed with me, and it says W.M., but I'll just spell it out. In this, W.M., sir, you agreed with me, and being thus empowered, I invited the whole of the local craft to take a position in the procession. Over 5,000 brethren responded. and by my direction were dressed in black, with crepe on the left arm, and a sprig of evergreen in the left lapel of the coat of each, the masters having been distinguished solely by their gavels, which they carried dressed in mourning. New York, page 93, 1865. From report of M.W. John L. Lewis, Chairman Committee of Foreign Correspondence. And there is a sorrow which we bear in common with our stricken nation, nay, let us add, of the other nations of the earth, that our honored Chief Magistrate has been removed by the wicked hand of violence in the hour of his greatest and noblest triumphs. It is the heart throb of an undivided people, who, forgetting every past difference and every division which has for a brief time separated them, mournfully entwine the laurel with the cypress. Ohio, from the address of Thomas Sparrow, Grand Master, October 17, 1865. On the morning of the 15th of April last, the public mind was astounded by the announcement that the constitutional ruler of this great nation had been basely murdered, that he who was so lately was in every mouth the theme of praise or blame had gone beyond the reach of both. No man was ever called to greater trials in political life. No man ever bore these trials with greater patience. In the very midst of them, in the very exposition of his principles and purposes, he paused to give utterance to the noble sentiment, which I trust will govern us on this and every other occasion. Quote, with charity towards all, with malice to none, doing the right, so far as God gives us to know the right, let us strive to finish the work we are in. Praise to the man who could utter such a sentiment. He was stricken down at the very moment when the minds of men of all parties and every diversity of views had acquired confidence in his moderation and wisdom, and we were turned towards him as the only one capable of adjusting the complicated questions arising out of the state of the country and the bitter animosity generated by 4 years of civil strife. Quote, praise to the man. A nation stood beside his coffin with wet eyes. Her brave, her beautiful, her good, as when a loved one dies. In this universal grief of the nation, I thought it proper that the fraternity, as such, should express not only their utter abhorrence of, quote, the deep damnation of his taking off, but pay a tribute of respect to his virtues as a man and his integrity as a public servant. Accordingly, at the request of the Brethren of Cleveland, I issued a dispensation authorizing them to appear in public on the reception of his remains in that city, and on their arrival here, I opened the Grand Lodge, and in conjunction with the Right Worshipful Deputy Grand Master and a large concourse of brethren from all parts of the state, participated in his funeral obsequies. The death of the President. Your committee, to whom was referred so much of the Grand Master's address, as related to the deaths of the late President of the United States, beg leave to report that there has been and can be but one feeling among the craft in Ohio in relation to the death of the late President Lincoln, and that is of deep regret at his decease, and of the utmost abhorrence of the crime by which he was removed. Your committee sincerely and heartily reciprocate the sentiments expressed by the Grand Master in relation to the lamentable event, and approve the language in which they were uttered. Your committee submit for your approval the following. Resolved, that the Freemasons of Ohio yield to no class of citizens in their devotion to the government and union established by our patriotic fathers, and have attested their loyalty thereto in every possible manner, the record of which is found not only at home but on many a crimson field. Resolved, that while we sympathize with the country at large in the bereavement which it sustained in the death of President, we regard with unmixed abhorrence and detestation The fiendish act which deprived the nation of its constitutional head at a perilous juncture in its history, respectfully submitted, Cornelius Moore, J.N.O. period, D. O'Connor. Not sure what J.N.O. could be. That's a first name abbreviation, J.N.O. Jonas, maybe. D. O'Connor. J.H. Barnhill. Above resolutions were unanimously adopted. Wisconsin. From the address of G.W. Washburn, G.M. June 13, 1865. But while we may rejoice that victory has perched upon our banners and right has come out triumphant in the contest, we cannot fail to share in the general grief that he whose petition made him conspicuous above all others should be destined to close his career upon this earth by the hand of a brutal and cowardly wretch who runs from the scene of his terrible crime, exulting in his infamy and shame. It is not for me to pronounce the President's eulogy, nor is this the occasion for it. History will deal fairly by him, and the world will judge him in kindness. Okay, that's the end of it. Thanks for dealing with my narration of this. I probably should have pronounced all the abbreviations. Don't know why. I just wanted to read them as they stood. So there you go.